the difference between augmented reality, virtual reality, and mixed reality. It is a range of experiences. On one hand, we have virtual reality, which is a total immersive experience where you put on a headset and you are disconnected from your environment. Everything you see and interact is a 3D generated object. And on the other hand, for augmented reality, you have a connection to your environment, like in HoloLens, and you have some extra information, maybe 3D or maybe audio information that's available to you, which is augmenting your reality. Also, we have mobile phone applications like Pokemon Go. You are looking through the glass of your phone and you're able to find 3D objects in the real world. And this whole range of experiences we call mixed reality. And short, it's called XR.
Well, hello, everybody. Welcome to another talk. Welcome, David.
Hello.
Thank you so much for joining us. So, yeah, let me quickly introduce you. That might be the best way of doing it. Well, David is the CEO of Umagen, and he's going to talk about authoring Serious XR for simulation, role-playing, and training. And he will be discussing how it's different from gaming. He's also going into tips and techniques. And I'm personally looking really forward to your session, David. Thank you so much for joining us.
Brilliant. Really good to be here.
Yeah, I think if you're ready, you can take it away.
Brilliant.
I will
up the slides. Perfect.
Yes, I will set.
So I think the really interesting aspect to creating I guess what we describe as a serious AR and VR experiences is you put a different spin on it than you might if you're working on a game. So, for example, engagement is incredibly important. You want all of your users to be really engaged in the training and the simulation and the role playing that's going on, but your focus is not to entertain them. Now, that's not to say that training and simulation and role-playing won't be entertaining, but often that comes out of the interaction of the individuals themselves, of the co-workers, the people working together who are involved in doing the training. It's not something you have to spend a lot of time on and strive to deliver some kind of hugely entertaining experience. If you can make that experience engaging and deliver the outcomes people want, people will enjoy it and will want to do it again, because it's better than traditional training and role-playing, that's for sure. I think the other really interesting change is that you generally have a facilitator, and that's not a small thing. So when you're making a game or an experience, often it will be designed to be run completely standalone, potentially even standalone from another intellectual property. So you might not have even a character that people know or a scene they know. This might be a totally new world that you're creating. So having a facilitator supported scenario is very different. You don't have to set the scene in the same way. Generally, people will know they're there for health and safety training or how to perform perhaps a certain task as a police officer. They're going through a traffic stop, and there's someone there to help them and to go through the process and to emphasize the things they need to learn and to add those teacher-focused elements. And you don't have to put those in the simulation. Those are provided by a real human, even if it's a virtual human during the training process. Another area that's really interesting is concepts and simulation are the heart of the AR and VR experience. The reality is that surprising people, giving people little puzzles to do, and expecting them to master, physical skills with their hands, it's just not a good fit. So, for example, if you've got a car assembly process that you're working through then you wouldn't be trying to teach people how to weld, because physically welding and all the skills involved are not suitable for using a controller. Even if you have a motion capture system like you see here, if you're doing surgical simulations, then you're teaching people the process. You're not trying to teach a surgeon how to suture. That's just not a realistic thing to teach with the kind of tools we have in VR and AR today, certainly. Yet the process is what people are there for. They're there to understand what's the scenario, how have I got here, what's going on in the scene, what should I do next, and then we can discuss it afterwards to see if I've done the right thing. So this is hugely valuable. You just need to be focused on the concepts and the simulation rather than, as I say, puzzles and skills. And then I think another area that's really interesting, which we commonly do when we're making entertainment, is we try and make it intriguing. We try and have twists. We try and hide nuggets of information away. Perhaps hide the motivation of some characters and reveal it later. In the case of training and simulation, you really want everything up front. Generally, you want stuff in written form as well as in spoken form. And you want to be very clear about what you're trying to achieve, because everyone will just be really, really frustrated. Now, that's not to say you don't surprise people. Surprising people is fine. If you're doing a scenario and something happens you didn't expect, how do you react to it? Certainly for first responder sort of scenarios like police officers, fire. If you're doing health and safety onboarding, you're trying to run through a scenario in a business doing car assembly and something happens on the line. Like, responding to a scenario is totally legitimate. It's about, surprise, we fooled you, we're training you on something else, is not the way to go. And then I think what people are looking to escape from is that kind of death by PowerPoint multi-choice experience. During enterprise training or enterprise simulation, they'll probably get plenty of that going on anyway. So when you're in AR VR, don't waste that time by making people watch long videos or reading lots of text or memorizing facts. Giving context and showing showing the tasks or showing the steps to do or the outcomes required is fine, but don't dump information in this environment on people. And it's not engaging to have people go through making lots of multi choices. Now, if the choices are branching a scenario and kind of leading you deeper into a richer scenario, I think that's totally fine, and people will understand that you can be upfront with that set of choices. So you have a choice as an officer about, for example, during the traffic stop where you stand or what you do next. That can be driven by your body and your posture and your hands. So those can be integrated into the experience. But sometimes you might have a choice where it's easier to say, do you want to, go into the house, or do you want to wait outside? And that could be selected from a multi-choice menu. That's not the same as this. This is saying, here are 50 questions. Do you choose ABC? And I think one of the most important things that we've discovered during this process is don't provide a one-time experience. Don't create something that's really broad that you run through once. Create something that's really deep that you do a lot of times. So allow for variability, allow for things to be changed, add some surprises, and then that provides for an after experience review. So as a group of people who are being trained, we can all sit down and say, how do we handle that? Could we do it better? How could we improve the efficiency? How could we improve the safety? Whatever the driving topic is. And a really good measure for this, I think, is, would an audience enjoy watching this? Would they enjoy participating in discussion around the VR or the AR experience that's going on in front of them? In fact, in a number of the scenarios for this training, that's how it works. So you might even have a classroom of people watching two people up front going through a scenario. Then as a group, you'll make suggestions about how you can improve it. The next two will come up and have a go, and everybody's watching on a big screen the third person experience. They're not suffering from any kind of nausea, because if you're not in the headset, it can be a bit off-putting. So having the fixed camera or minimum camera moves really helps. So in terms of sort of getting creativity out, I think avoiding information dumps is a good, as I've mentioned earlier, a good idea. But I think it really helps with creating the opportunity for creativity. So you're trying to simulate a process or an interaction, and if you focus on that, if you don't worry about conveying, lists and screeds of information, if you're focused on how to make this interaction, how to simulate this process or this role playing better, then sort of little it's like emergent behavior. Things come out of that deep simulation that really enable you to you to be creative, but also the process, I think, is very creative in terms of how the interaction with your users goes. Another area which is really interesting is which is very common in the game is creating lots of assets can be important because you want your world to seem maybe endless. That's not required here. In fact, getting bogged down and creating assets can be a real distraction from the creation of a rich scenario. So I think narrow but deep rather than wide and shallow. Make the space you're in really rich, and make all of the tools, hopefully, or the elements you can see in the scene here, say they might be configurable. So this is a conceptual fusion reactor, and you can configure things in different ways depending on how you want to run the scenario. And you can offer those tools to the users, or you can offer them to the facilitator. So the facilitator, much like almost like a Dungeons and Dragons game or a role-playing game, can play with the scenario and take they can read the room, understand what people need to learn, and actually adjust things on the fly. So it's really pretty cool. And that leads to this last point, which is really interesting. When you're trying to build on creativity, I think something that people often miss in this sort of business scenario is that your users are actually incredibly creative as well. And if you have groups of 30 people through over a period of months, there'll be a lot of ideas thrown at you that you might not have come up with. So that ability to have a single scenario that you continue to enhance and make sort of deeper and better and richer, take that feedback from your users and update that scenario to incorporate some of their ideas during that time period. And it can be quite amazing what can emerge out of that process. The kinds of suggestions that you get, I mean, often these are people who are incredibly experienced in their field. They're also seeing things that are happening today. So one of the things we find with trainers is they were often they've often been in that field, incredibly experienced, senior firefighters, senior experienced heads of engineering kind of roles that have moved into the sort of training space. And what's happening today on the plant as the assembly line is moving to electrified cars, there'll be things that are new and different that they hadn't experienced when they were in that role themselves. And now that they're in training, getting that feedback from the front line, getting that feedback from, now people don't have keys under the door because everybody's using their cell phone to unlock their door, or whatever it might be. So taking that feedback directly from the people who are on the ground experiencing the training is a really good approach. So that's sort of the scene setting. And then really there are sort of three key elements for success, which I've kind of touched on a bit, but I'm going to go into some detail about how we've been able to sort of scale up and improve our processes in terms of resulting in great outcomes. And I think that is different from the way you would do it traditionally in perhaps in a gaming environment. So I think the biggest thing I could say for the sort of the serious VR and XR, the VR and AR is hero content. So generally, it's something you're focusing on. Maybe it's a robot in a process for car assembly, and you're going through a process of interacting with that robot in a safe fashion. So having the exact robot, say it's a 6 foot, big car assembly KUKA robot. You want it to look like that. You want it to have the hydraulic cables. You want it to have the presence of that in physical space. And then, the reality is, if you can get, that as a purchased asset, it's worth spending some money on. That's going to be sort of the highlight of the scene. And then around it, you're probably going to be building the production line, the cages. Some of that may come from BIM systems or building information management systems. You might be able to get CAD data. In the case of some of the outdoor scenarios, there might be photogrammetry or terrain data available that you can use. So you want to set the scene and give people some context. And then in the case of, for example, that robot in the car assembly, you might want to move around during the scenario the different elements. So where are the tools sitting? Which direction does the production line run? How close are the cages to the robot? Where are we setting people up to stand and work? So I think people will accept without any question at all, roughly textured conveyor belt if they've got some hero content that really engages them in the scenario, because that's the piece that they need to be focused on, and their safety and their interaction with that hero element. So if you're thinking of a sort of a role-playing scenario, it can be a pro forma Skydome and city scene, as long as the characters they're interacting with, are engaging and have great dialogue, and they can talk through their role-playing scenario like the traffic stop. As long as there's a range of experiences, so they don't feel like they're just seeing the same thing again and again. So you focus on the content that's key to the experience you're trying to deliver, which is, as I say, usually some kind of training, simulation, or role-playing. And generally, by the way, it's something that's too hard or expensive to do in person. So no one wants to shut down a production line or have a spare, $34 million KUKA robot sitting around for training, right? It's just not a simple or realistic thing to do. Nobody wants to do an after-action review on a helicopter rescue in the middle of a city with tall buildings. Those are the exact kind of examples that you want to simulate in this environment, because you can do it lots of times. You can try different things, and you're not paying for a robot or hiring or looking at a fake robot or a stationary cardboard additive when you're in the VR experience and the AR experience, and it can be very compelling. And voice acting goes a long way, which we'll talk about a bit later. There's a lot of sites for buying content. Just a small, it's just a touching on some great photogrammetry material, that Epic have been getting with things like Quixels and so on. In terms of the character creators, there's some really good tools starting to come out now. We use Reallusion Character Creator a lot. Blender Human Generator is really cool. Epic Meta Human Creators coming soon. Being able to build a realistic human isn't as hard as it used to be. If you had to model it from scratch, it's a pretty tough job. If you can sort of pick from the clothes and the character and the gender you need, make yourself a set of characters, and then animate them. And there's lots of motion capture. And then, in fact, in several of the examples here I'm showing, a lot of our training runs in a co-spacing environment. So it's actually in a live motion capture environment, so that we can track multiple people, whether they be in AR and VR. But the idea is that as they pick up an object, we know exactly where that object is. We know what they're picking up. We know where they're putting it. So we can have all that information about the motion study. And we'll talk about that in the measurement section. And then another area which is really interesting is, in a game, you're trying to maintain maybe an art style. You're trying to maintain a level of coherency as you move around large worlds. In this environment, you're creating room scale worlds. So, iPhone LiDAR, just taking lots of photos and using photogrammetry, Matterport scanners, RevoPop have got a nice high-res scanner, 360 cameras, video and audio collection on scene. So this idea of creating some assets, which just needs to put people in the space where you can display the hero content and the key interaction, and you don't, it doesn't have to be the perfect, most amazingly modeled thing. If it reflects a real world scenario that they can imagine themselves being in, then you're going to be successful in terms of the result. I think one of the challenges is, which is a bit of a weird one to mention, is actually the floor plane. So generally people are walking around a flat floor, hopefully for training room setup, without having people trip over and hurt themselves. And so it does mean that you will have to potentially edit or add a floor plane layer. If you've got photogrammetry that's at an angle or has big lumps in it, you'll need to try and smooth that out so that there's no disconnect between what people see and what they experience. It's less of an issue potentially for some of the AR scenarios. But even then, if you're placing things in the scene, you need to make sure they're placed on a flat ground plane to align with your physical world space. And then another thing I'd suggest, which we've found to be really successful now that there are so many good automated rigging tools, which is how you can add a skeleton to things like bipeds or quadrupeds, is you can take advantage of modeling services. So there's some amazing artists who can use tools like Blender and deliver models at pretty low cost that you can then, if they're static or simple PRS, position, rotation, scale models, you're good to go. And if they're humans or quadrupeds, then you can rig them much more quickly. So it's a lot less of a burden perhaps than it used to be, even 4 years ago. So in terms of the story selling, scene setting, and instructions, generally your audience, hopefully if the trainer is, if they're turning up for training on the right basis, they're going to know the business background. And you want to establish your scenario highlights pretty quickly. You don't want to belabor that point. This isn't some new world. You've got to teach them a massive backstory. I think the other thing that's really important is people get extremely frustrated if there's stuff that they can't interact with, that they try and interact with. So they're sitting there trying to hit the control panel for a few minutes. So I think highlighting the avatars, props, and objects which users can interact with is quite beneficial. That may seem like it breaks the connection with reality, but these people are here to do business training. You just want to make it quick and clear. Here are the things here are the tools you have at your disposal to interact with to complete this scenario and achieve your outcome. And then I think audio dialogue and sound effects have been an extremely cost-effective way to enhance the experience. You can have a VP of one of the departments record some audio, and you can have little bits of humor in there, and it's something that's easy essentially for the customer to provide and to continue to manage when we're thinking of the training department, to really it just adds a lot of a layer of flavor that perhaps gives you some of that entertainment value, but also can be quite engaging. So if you're, for example, an emergency medical technician, an EMT, and you're turning up to a scene on the road, hearing someone screaming in the tree line is actually quite visceral in a headset. So audio can really enhance scenarios. And then in terms of making sure people have visual feedback as well as audio feedback, that's incredibly important. I mean, people can be distracted, people can be be limited in their actual hearing. So being able to display little status icons, or where you might have a longer instruction, being able to have a short set of bullets that explain what the current status or step is, or what they should be doing. And we've actually had good success in a range of our scenarios by using almost like a whiteboard, and you can turn around and there's generally a whiteboard there, and it has a list of what's currently going on, and it's turned out to be quite a good conceptual training prop for a number of different kinds of scenarios. So interaction and measurement. So this is I guess a really interesting area. So and I'll probably dwell on this a little bit just because it's an area of really interesting research. So with this motion tracking system, you can see on the right-hand side, we have little active LEDs. Those can be tracked at up to 966 hertz, or nearly 1,000 frames every second. So we know exactly where that tube that person's holding. We know where their fingers are. We know where their hand is. And we know where their wrist is. So importantly, particularly if you're in a VR scenario, but also if you're in an AR scenario, we can track what they're doing. So we can tell how they've rotated it, where they've placed that tube, if they passed it to another user, because you can have multiple people in the same environment. If you're in VR, that's incredibly important because you can't see that. You're wearing a VR headset, so you're seeing a virtual version of that same tube. So the ability to take actual props and equipment and have multiple people interacting together, maybe working on a CPR dummy that's physically there in real life. You're doing compressions on the chest of a real CPR dummy that has all the sensors and IoT information. You're getting that feedback in real time in VR. In VR, you've got a person with pupils. You have to check if they're dilated. So you can add, they can be making noises as they start to come to, and you've got to turn them on their side, and you can go through the whole process. So it's really interesting when you mix and match the real world and the virtual world, and this allows you to do that. But what we've also found, and gamification is thrown around a lot, and I feel like there's often a misunderstanding about what gamification means in the context of sort of those businessy, enterprisey apps. There was an infamous story about Microsoft Office, who were very successful in gamifying their Office suite, where you could get stars and rewards for completing tasks within Microsoft Office and Microsoft Excel. And they discovered that lots of the staff in these organizations were grinding these to get 10 stars and achieve their outcomes. And humans just like to do that. They like to be able to, I should say a certain percentage of people just like to be able to measure and achieve. It gives them a feeling of satisfaction. Now, in that case, it was actually reducing productivity, unfortunately, because people were busy grinding Office instead of putting the training into action, should I say. So if we look at the context here, when you want to gamify something like this, what we're really saying is we want to measure and provide metrics, and those are displayed on screen, and the people in the experience can see them, but also the people, the facilitator, and the people watching, the other people who will be moving through this training process and are, I guess, being trained on the overall concept. And what we've found is it enables you to teach subjects that are much, much more subtle and complicated than you would normally be able to teach. So, for example, process improvement is a real opportunity with this system. So what you can do is, say, for example, you have two goals. One is efficiency for, say, a production line process, and the other goal might be safety. You can literally display a little chart that's showing, for this task, from step 1 through 6, we've gone through, we've taken the wiring harness, we've fitted it inside the car, we've screwed down the bolts, the car has moved through the assembly line. And we can say, how many steps did we take, the people in the scenario who are doing the work to do the assembly? Perhaps how many lifts away from the body did they do? How much weight did they have to lift? Because it depends on which type of power ratchet is used, whether it's a gas one, or is it supported by a spring from above? Is it just a standalone tool? How many times did they bend at the knees? How many times did they bend at the back? How many times did they turn their wrist? How close did they get to the giant 6 foot tall industrial robot? How close did they get to the stamping press? Did they have to walk on and off the moving travel way, which is actually the conveyor bot actually moves. It's almost like a physical conveyor. And when you see all those metrics, and you've got a group of people there over a period of time, and they're thinking, well, let's try this scenario. Let's move the tools closer. And you take the physical tray of tools and you wheel it closer because it's using those same red motion trackers. So you can, some things are physically configured in the scenario by doing them differently. And then sometimes the facilitator can switch them on and off. So they can say, hey, we're going to switch from using a battery-powered rotational tool to using a air-powered tool, which will have a support line from above. And that has some pluses and some minuses. It might be slower to do the technique, but it will improve the wear and tear on the user because there's less weight. And so what people are able to see is that this is it's gray. There's not specifically a right or wrong answer, but I can see how we can improve things. I can make suggestions. I can understand ideas. And these organizations have people whose only job is to work out the best process. What they're trying to do is to teach everybody in the production process what this process is, that they can make suggestions, and that when suggestions come down to them, people have really thought about this, and if they implement them, they'll be safer and the work they do will be more efficient. So for example, something like this has completely changed the mindset of the people working on the shop floor. And we talk about the creativity example. Equally, those people on the shop floor obviously have lots of good ideas as well, because they're practically doing this for many hours a day. So that's kind of what I mean when I talk about this kind of gamification, this ability to have measurable metrics, to be able to run a scenario multiple times, and to see how you've done, and as a group to measure or try and make suggestions to improve that measurement. Within the idea of having a series of stages, most of the authoring tools we've worked with support some kind of flow diagram. It may be that within this, it's not just enough to say there are 6 states. You may actually have to choose a different branching flow depending on the thing you're trying to simulate. There might be 2 distinctly different choices, or 3 or 4 distinctly different choices. That is a little bit more complicated, perhaps, for a facilitator to manage during a live session. But one way around that is to start up. Maybe you've got 3 different versions of the scenario. So just to be a matter of just quickly booting up into version 1, version 2, or version 3, depending on what the group wants to go through or review. So there's ways around managing it. And I guess the other cool thing you can do within this is, if you've got little surprises that you can trigger, this can be really important. So this is more like the simulation role-playing scenarios. So for example, you could have a police scenario and you're doing a traffic stop, and then someone on the street pulls a gun, or you could have a car drive into someone behind you. And if you're trying to, if the cadet has kind of got into the groove and they're just going through the motions, that's something the facilitator can do to just just like real life, things will be thrown at you sideways. So that's what I meant earlier when I talked about a surprise. Throwing surprises at people as part of this process is good, as long as it's not you're surprising them about the fact that they're learning something totally different. Excellent. And then I've got some summary points, and there's some really interesting stuff has played out over time as we started working on this kind of enterprise training and simulation and role playing. Often there are quite challenging interpersonal interactions, quite emotionally charged situations that are difficult for a voice actor to pull off 5 times a day, every day. So believe it or not, people will often sit in the classroom and try and role play domestic dispute situations, and it's just not realistic when one of your peers, dressed in their officer's uniform, is trying to pretend to be a distressed individual in a domestic dispute. It's tough to take it seriously. The great thing about the voice acting in a captured scenario is, you can really, if you've got someone who's come in and done that acting for you, you can leverage that across the same scenario many times with different cadets trying to go through this process, or different officers trying to go through this process if you're changing your protocol. When you've got complex decision making, when there's a lot of factors, when there's emergency or high stress situations, those are things that are difficult to replicate if you're just sitting in a classroom. So it enables trainees to sort of build that muscle memory and to kind of deal with things in stressful situations. And particularly people who haven't done a lot of work in VR or AR, when you have stereo audio and things going on in your visual system, it's a lot more immersive, and can be quite compelling for people. So I think having that situation, having scenarios play out differently, letting the facilitator have some control, you can then play out that scenario, and then I say good or bad here, but once again, it'd be gray. Did you respond quick enough? Because the facilitator can say, well, you're a bit slow in making that decision. Something might have gone wrong before that happened. We needed to get to that person sooner and start intubating them because they were bleeding on the road. So that ability to sit down and discuss afterwards is really powerful, and it's not something you'd have in a game. This is very much a petri dish for you to experiment in, if you think of it that way. That's how training, facilitated training, plays out in the best way. To the point I just made earlier, repetition could be really costly. Like if you actually have to, for example, hire actors, I mean, that's very expensive, and sometimes that is done as a combination. So, maybe biannually, for example, fire departments will run scenarios where they literally have, local youth groups and actors playing different roles and lying down and being covered with blood, and they have to, go around a simulated fire environment. But it's pretty tricky to do any of these things on a big scale repeatedly, and VR in particular allows that kind of immersion to be done. And then I think within the AR space, the other thing you can do is you can augment physical things. So you can take physical props and augment them with additional things. So panels can come to life without the machine having to be in an emergency breakdown situation. You could have literally a nuclear control room panel. You can go through scenarios with the actual panels that you wouldn't really want to be to enable in real life. And then one of the other areas we've been working a lot on, as I say, we use a motion stage, is motion capture. So then being able to capture motions and replay them for future people. So actually as part of the authoring process, which is pretty cool. I think that muscle memory I've covered already, but digital twins are really interesting. So if I go back to that that nuclear control panel, what you can actually do is a lot of organizations now are developing basically machine learning models or databases or mathematical models of how parts of their process might operate, where they've got machines and equipment, or maybe it's production and agriculture. They've got models that kind of mimic real world scenarios. So if you reduce the amount of nitrogen fixation in the soil, you're going to get less soybeans. So this ability to actually have a digital twin that has like dials that you can turn is really interesting. So how people respond, what they do, given these inputs in my simulation, what's the output? You can really deliver things that are even right up to the executive level, are really compelling and engaging learning and discussion points. From the perspective of scenario trees, another area that we've been working on a lot is using voice triggers. And as long as it's clear that there are voice triggers available and which path has been taken based on those voice triggers, we've found that they work really well. But you've got to be careful of people's accents and their comfort with using voice. And while it may seem like you're breaking the reality barrier, sometimes choosing an option can still be the best, just because it's really clear to people what's going on. But the voice recognition is really excellent now, the cloud-based voice recognition, and it does handle a pretty wide range of accents, even my Kiwi accent sometimes. So yeah, I think it's an area still for exploration. It's still a little bleeding edge in terms of really, you want 99% success. You don't want 80% success, because that means 20% of the time people have gone in the wrong path, which is really frustrating. So yeah, so I think it's definitely worth exploring. And then I think simplifying the content creation is a huge deal. So the idea of taking those scenarios and making them deep and improving them over time is a really big deal. And then the ability to use them multiple times. So that's probably the biggest takeaway I would have, is that people who are going through training will happily come back to a rich scenario many, many times. They will want to watch a PowerPoint no times, like a series of bullet points. So it's pretty cool watching people, going from being disengaged and kind of wanting to sleep on the desk to, to really excited about the process and, bubbling and discussing with their peers and the facilitators what they could do and how they could improve things. Excellent. So that's the core presentation.
Yes, David, thank you so much. We do have a couple of questions, if that's okay.
Perfect.
The first one. In the beginning of the presentation, you mentioned hero content. Could you explain a little bit what that is? I personally was questioning it, and we got the question from the audience as well.
I apologize. It's a term from the movie industry. So when you're making 3D models of characters and you've got, your Avengers and everyone's in the distance, like a lot of those bad guys, you don't bother making a hero model because they're always, a long way away. You don't get close enough to see them. But when Iron Man comes right up to the foreground, or Spider-Man comes right up to the foreground, you've got to have a hero. You've got to have a really nice piece of content. And that's really what I'm referring to. So usually in a simulation or a piece of training, there's a thing. So in this case, there's a water turbine that we're trying to discuss and go through the engineering, and where should we place the turbine, and what's the water flow, and what if we mount it a higher or lower, and what if we change the blade rate. So that's the piece of content that has to be perfect. That ground plane, it's probably the wrong scale. It looks it's a PBR texture. It's not perfect. People don't really care. What they care about is that piece of hero content. So if you can sell people, if you're going to spend your money on a great piece of hero content. And when I say money, and whether it be physically buying something or your time to create it.
Very interesting. Yeah, actually, I think we do that as well. So the reason I was really interested in your talk is that we are kind of close when doing things. And I was really glad you mentioned CPR mannequin, because that is exactly what we are doing.
Awesome.
We're building a HoloLens app that is using a physical CPR mannequin with Bluetooth connected, and then overlaying a character on there, so you feel the character when you do CPR, but you get feedback from it. So I was really, really delighted that you mentioned that. But you also were talking about the tracking of the objects. How do you track these? Are these with the active LEDs as well?
Yeah, so we have a few different techniques. So if you're using a solo experience, then we can generally just use the tracking system that's provided for the controllers, for example, and it generally does an okay job, whether it be a lighthouse or the track controllers with the Quest 2, for example. But whenever we're trying to do a co-spacing environment, which is, for an enterprise training setup, they're generally they've got a space, they've got a whole setup. So, and you're probably, say, for example, there's a car chassis in the middle of the room. You've got maybe up to 2 or 3 people at a station who are working together. So it makes total sense to be able to install one of those motion tracking systems. And we use, there's a company called Phase Space who make those little active markers. And the best thing about that system is there's no ambiguity. So basically what it tells us is, here are all the points, here are all the rigid bodies. And we know it's my elbow, not somebody else's elbow. It's not just an infrared marker that's totally nameless. So the great thing about it is, literally in real time, as you're walking around, at 1,000 hertz, I'm passing you. I can throw you a ball and you can catch it, which is pretty crazy in VR.
That's cool.
So yes, we have people holding the actual tools. So we take actual rivet guns, and you put LEDs on it, and now they've got a rivet gun that they can hold and pass to other people. So yeah, it's pretty fun. And to your point about the mannequin, I think the other thing is there's lots of equipment that you can get feeds and data from, and that really does enrich the experience for the users. And when you're trying to do things like maintenance scenarios, then knowing what's turned on, what's happening, have you connected all the right parts, all that kind of stuff can be hooked as well.
Great. Well, that's all the questions there were. So yeah, I think I have to thank you for your great talk. And yeah, that's it. Have a nice day, I guess.
Awesome. Thank you very much indeed.
And now I need to figure out. All right. We hope. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Cheers.